Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Keat TV in Eureka, California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. The roots of the transcendent run very deep in our species. We often hear how the United States supposedly attracts the vast majority of UFO sightings, and that this somehow helps debunk the phenomenon. Such statements are demonstrably false. Sightings of craft, lights, and entities from the sky, from space, and from the ether are as old as humanity itself and are virtually ubiquitous across cultures and worldviews. Whether classified as religion, mysticism, folklore, fantasy, or campfire narrative, these stories reveal that we've never been alone on this planet. At times, we've been blinded by arrogance, distracted by the material, but never alone. It's only since the advent of physicalist materialism as our operative ontology that these presences have been dismissed as illusion, misidentification, and outright error. Our guest today, Dr. Marques Redd, is an expert on how these phenomena have manifested in the cradle of humankind, the African continent. We'll discuss some of those traditions and how they relate to the overall subject and what they reveal about us, our spirit, our gendered identities, and sacred knowledge. We'll also discuss the choice he made to swerve away from an academic and clinical approach to these subjects in order to develop a more visceral and creative approach as artist and seeker. His work is brilliant, challenging, and helps us contextualize the phenomenon in our lives and societies by demonstrating that these facts and connections don't have to be dead myth, but can become a vibrant and important part of how we live and interpret the world. Welcome to the show, Dr. Redd.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you um, bringing your perspective, which I think is something I haven't talked a whole lot about in terms of sort of an international approach to what the phenomenon represents and that sort of thing. I'm intrigued by your story, so let's start there. I know that you were an academic first, and that's sort of how you got into these topics. Can we talk a little bit about what drew you to this kind of subject matter in an academic vein, and then maybe build into how you swerved into being more of an artist to find that path?
Sure, that's a great question. So I will say that I've always had an obsession with ancient Egypt, even from the time I was a child. Every day after school, particularly in middle school, I had to walk to the library, which was fairly close to the middle school I went to wait for my parents to pick me up when they got off of work. And so every day I would walk down the aisles of the library, and I was really drawn to these large coffee table sized books around ancient Egypt, seeing the pyramids, seeing the hieroglyphics, seeing the tombs, the temples. And so I think that early interest as a child was something that never left me. And when I started my academic career, that was the topic that I wanted to delve into more deeply. I mean, trying to wrap my mind around just the grandeur of the ancient civilization and trying to understand how such a miracle could have really manifested. So I pursued that as an interest. I was an undergrad majoring in social studies and African American studies at Harvard. And even there, I was thinking about the influence of ancient Egyptian cosmology in Plato, particularly in his late dialogues.
Yeah.
From there, went to UC Berkeley, also still following the same topic, looking at the influence of ancient Egypt. But in this particular case, I focused on British and American literature of the 19th century, 18th and 19th century,
Hmm.
and was on track to pursue a standard career in academia in English as an English professor. Um, and I was very content to do that. But at a certain point, as I started noticing how many writers from, in the English context, from the 1500s all the way down to the present, were obsessed with this topic of Egypt, whether it was thinking about the hieroglyphs or thinking about mystical traditions like Freemasonry that also
Hmm.
drew on a lot of Egyptian iconography. I started to wonder for myself, I mean, what was it about this particular subject? What was it about this particular location that drew people in so deeply? So at a certain point into my professorial career, I made a switch and said, okay, well, I want to actually just explore this more as a practitioner than just as a scholar. And so I stepped away from the academy to do that for several years, actually. And then as I was getting deeper into that personal ritual work, it seemed that I came to art as the best medium for housing that exploration.
Yeah. So I'm interested. I mean, how did you construct sort of a practice or it sounds like there's a mystical side to what you're exploring there. How did you build that up? I mean, was it just like you went through is there a living tradition there, I guess is what I'm
Yeah,
asking, or
that's
did
a
you
great
have to kind of
question.
build that?
That's a great question. So I would say it was also inspired by, I would say, an introduction to Santeria, which is a particular Afro-Cuban spiritual tradition that draws a lot from a West African Yoruba context. And many of enslaved people from West Africa brought traditions to the New World that were synthesized and reconfigured in new ways. And so when I moved to California for graduate school, I ended up meeting people who were affiliated with different kinds of Santeria houses. I actually had a chance myself to go to Cuba and work with different groups in Matanzas. And I think being exposed to a, as you call it, a living tradition, a living African tradition, actually started to illuminate the ancient work in in new ways for me. I started to be able to understand certain representations in text as ancestor rituals or certain kinds of illusions that Egyptologists will paper over as certain forms of ancestor communication or as post-mortem explorations. And so I began to see even moments of, let's say, transpossession or things of that sort, things that move beyond what Egyptologists were comfortable with exploring in those particular texts. So I think seeing um, a kind of a ritual practice, a kind of a group practice around contemporary traditions helped me have a key, if you will, to unlock certain things that I was seeing in the ancient text but didn't have a context for. So I think with that grounding and with that understanding of other kinds of Afro-diasporic traditions, I was able to kind of craft my own unique approach to reanimating the ancient texts and trying to activate them in my own way.
It's fascinating and I think beautiful. It's interesting. Did your, I mean, were you pushed to explore this because of your own identity in any way, or did you feel empowered by doing this in terms of constructing, having permission to sort of construct that? Because a lot of folks may feel inhibited in that kind of transaction, especially scholars, because they're taught to keep it at a distance and to not sort of get involved in the subjective end of the study of cultures and that sort of thing. But did you feel like you had more permission, or I mean, I know it's a touchy subject, but I'm just trying to get at,
No, that's a great question. And I would say there's many layers of answers I could give to that, but I will say
Sure.
yes, for sure. There were parts of my own kind of identity exploration that were a part of this journey as well. Particularly thinking as a Black gay man, trying to understand what is my place in in some of these traditions, what is my place kind of in the larger kind of cultural milieu? Where can I find my own particular legacies and histories in the historical record? And that certainly was a part of it. And of course, just the contemporary political scene. I mean, we know just even in the last year or 2 years, I mean, there have been over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been put forward in state legislatures around the country. And even on the continent, you've got places like Uganda and Nigeria that have these draconian um, anti anti-LGBTQ laws. So I was really trying to ask, I mean, are there places in traditional African cosmology that might tell a different story or open up new pathways to the divine, new kinds of spiritual traditions that might have been occluded because of racism, homophobia, colonialism, etc. And I certainly found that that was the case. I mean, particularly in ancient Egypt, I mean, there's an entire record of these androgynous or queer deities. I mean, so
And
a
you have
figure,
whole works of art that are dedicated to that, with
oh
like
yeah,
pantheons that are around that, and I'll, you know, show that in this interview. We'll have some of those images, but I thought that was particularly powerful, especially because I mean, you mentioned those, you know, the African regimes that have a particular problem with, LGBT communities, and it seems like that's coming from a colonialist past. I mean, and I don't need to. I mean, they feel the way they feel, but it's like I think that it comes out of a product of oppression and trauma that they've suffered, and that's how it's being expressed now. And it's sort of like this gift that keeps on giving, you know?
yeah,
Um,
well, absolutely. And all kinds of monotheistic bias, all of these
yeah,
kinds of things get added into the mix as well.
yeah,
But yeah, but I guess since you mentioned it, I'll go ahead and speak about that. So one of the most recent art projects that I've completed is a series of 16 life-size glass sculptures called Men Signs of the Gatekeepers, which really assembles a pantheon of these Black queer deity figures. One of whom, as I was about to mention earlier, is this figure named Hapi, who was thought of as the personification of the fertility and abundance of the Nile River, was depicted as a man, but as a man that had these large breasts and a pregnant stomach. So we could think about this figure as even the first androgynous deity of human history, a figure who represents, let's say, enlightenment as the fusion of these masculine and feminine traits, as a symbol of group unity, as far as the kind of cultural unity that was needed to understand how to deal with the annual flooding of the Nile River, to be able to know how to work together to prepare and protect the larger collective against floods that could possibly destroy everything if, you know, buildings weren't set back at the right distance, if the planting and harvesting wasn't organized properly. So yeah, so I wanted to think about how can we use those archives and activate them in a new way for our current moment.
yeah. I think it's fantastic, and we'll show those images. The sculptures are absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's really, really good work. So I want to congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
Um, uh, one of the things that I mean, one of the things that I cover a lot here is sort of numinosity, right? Like people having encounters with whether it's alien beings or spiritual beings of a sort, or that sort of thing. I'm interested in your process of, you know, sort of getting to know your own spirituality and constructing it. When was there a moment where like it became efficacious in a way that surprised you and made it more real than, say, you know, kind of an act or a intellectual exploration, but really like kind of zapped you with some sort of metaphysical power?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, but I think if one participates really in any traditional African spiritual system, I mean, you will quickly see things that move beyond what the mainstream deems to be normal. I mean, seeing people go into trance, seeing people communicate with the dead, seeing objects move across the room in ways that kind of defy the laws of physics, seeing people channeling different spiritual presences or speaking information they would not have known otherwise. I mean, all of those kinds of phenomena that are deemed anomalous are actually more of the norm in those particular indigenous spiritual contexts.
Well, and that's what part of what my study has revealed. I mean, that's more the norm across the globe, except for this exception that we're living in now, where we've kind of defined it out of existence. And then even so, we're seeing these penetrations that are coming from various directions, that I think are starting to point out to more folks that there is more going on to reality than we've decided we know. And that's part of the adventure of the show. And my own exploration is just to try to collect people's experience in that regard, and let people know that I think it's okay that if they're having those experiences, and to even court them, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
well, and it's interesting, and I think in many respects, in particular, let's think about the ancient Egyptian context. I mean, I think the entire goal of many of those cultural creations was to actually stimulate that kind of internal spiritual understanding and epiphany. I mean, so even if you look at, let's say, the hieroglyphics, I mean, the glyphs were not meant to be just a dead language. I
Hmm.
mean, you have images of a wide panoply of natural and man-made objects. I mean, so you have images of, let's say, insects, of birds, of different kinds of animals, each with their own symbolic meaning. Once one learns the language, the idea is that the glyphs themselves are supposed to come alive, and the glyphs themselves are supposed to speak to you. You're supposed to start noticing omens in the real world that mirror the glyphs that you find in the script. So the entire point of the writing system, of the megalithic statues, of the way in which art was impressed into public spaces was to actually stimulate the expansion of consciousness, was meant to push people beyond the normal box of sense experience. And I would say that's probably one difference, or one of many differences from the ancient context to our modern, is that you had an entire state effort towards divinizing the
Yeah,
population, towards
yeah,
enlightening people, towards um, producing and presenting God forms that people are supposed to transform themselves into.
yeah. And I think that that's absolutely. I mean, it's demonstrated how powerful that tradition was because we're still mystified by relics from Egypt. Like, I mean, we talk about the pyramids and stuff, and people kind of go nuts over the theories. They get ramped up about like what it was and what it may do and why it was built and how it, there is encoded within the structure all these mathematical truisms and stuff. And it's like, it's still inspiring us to kind of reach for um, with the numinous through its structure and beauty and all of that. Then that again goes toward the idea that like there was a lot of knowledge in Africa throughout history that just baffles modern experts. I mean, we've talked before, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the Dogon tradition. I know it's a lot of people know about it, but basically this tribe knew about the binary star system that they shouldn't been able to see because it's not visible without a telescope, and they didn't have modern telescopes when these traditions were made, but yet they knew about it and they used some very specific language that kind of pointed to its existence. And how did they know about that if they, didn't have the technology? We don't know. And then by the same token, the technology, not even with the pyramids, but there are like vases and stuff that were constructed in Egypt that are so mathematically precise, and they encode sacred geometry in a bunch of different ways. And again, they didn't have the tools that we think are necessary for those kinds of constructions. I mean, that we know of. So it's just a lot of knowledge and a lot of mystery surrounding where that knowledge came from that again hints at this other layer to reality that they may have been using to access it. Any
Yeah,
thoughts on that
and
stuff?
yeah, oh gosh, I mean, many thoughts. Well, I would say on one hand, all of these African traditions, from the Dogon, as you mentioned, to ancient Egypt, were organized around cosmologies. And so the cosmologies were very specific maps that present a narrative about human possibility, about the particular steps that unfolded from creation to our material world, and a map of how we basically make our way back to that source. So I think it's the cosmology that kind of grounds everything because it is what gives you a vision of what human genius can accomplish, what human genius can be, and it gives you a map in the sense that it is saying that the purpose of human life is to become a divine being.
Mhm.
So you're given a very regimented set of steps into how to make that goal manifest. So all of these different pieces, all of these different knowledge systems are not simply about gathering this alienated knowledge about the world is not about treating the world as a dead material object, but it's really about using um, all of these symbols and rituals in order to facilitate this expansion process. And so even what you mentioned about Sirius, so the idea is that not just that Dogon people had this knowledge about the star system, but that the knowledge about the star system was very integrated into the fabric and the daily life of the culture. I mean, so
Yeah.
there were these rituals that would happen every 60 years that would be carried out to coincide with certain movements of those stars. I mean, so it was a sense that it's not just that we know the weight, the color, the size, but that these are living presences that really impact how we live our lives, how we project ourselves into the world. And it's important to think about some of the techniques also are important. I mean, so this idea that one can fuse one's own imaginal world with the world of the larger cosmos. I mean, so in many of these traditions, you get this idea about this primordial androgynous blackness that lies at the center of creation. And it really is the center of creation. And this idea that the world emerges from the transformations and unfoldings of this primal substance. And so, with that being the case, one can fuse, let's say, the blackness of one's own internal world, the kind
Mhm.
of blackness that we all see when we close our eyes, with the blackness of outer space. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, the cosmology helps understand the techniques through which to access this knowledge, the techniques with which to dissociate from the limits of the human body, and the ways in which to encode that knowledge to facilitate a spiritual exploration for a larger cultural context and collective as well.
Yeah. That's well put and a wonderful point. It's interesting to me. There seems to be this emerging thread throughout all the shows I've been doing a lot of the time, and that's that we may have it backwards in terms of our scientific ontology, and that the material universe might not be primary. That consciousness
Mm.
may be primary, and that different techniques throughout different points in history and different cultures have figured out ways to access that, and that within that there is access possible physically to other places. You can, sort of download memories of the whole creation through accessing this sort of conscious, um, you know, um, center that is the universe, and some people would call it God. And I think it's fascinating that cultures that we've so often considered primitive were so adroit at that kind of knowledge gathering. And that sort of leads to my next question, which is, mysticism is something that's spread throughout the world. There's the perennial tradition and those sorts of things. Um, does Africa get the credit it deserves in terms of the origins of that sort of thing? Or do you think it's been like, I mean, Plato, the Neoplatonists get a lot of credit. The Eastern Indian traditions get a lot of credit. But I think a lot of those ideas probably arose from, deeper in Africa. And you mentioned from the Egyptians. Can you help us sort of get an accurate picture of what the contribution
Oh, yeah.
is from that side of
Oh,
it?
I mean, certainly the Platonists and Neoplatonists. I mean, all of them are engaged with Egypt. I mean, directly and indirectly. I mean, Iamblichus has a tract that's called "On the Mysteries of the Egyptians." Plato spent time in Egypt, and particularly in the late dialogues, is constantly invoking figures like Tahuti, the deity of writing, and others. I mean, so yeah, the bread and butter of the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition certainly emerges from ancient Egypt. And I will say to your question, I mean, we're still at very early stages of unpacking all of all of the knowledge and all of the things that are embedded in African spiritual sciences. I mean, the depth and complexity of them really boggles the imagination the more you the more you dive into them. I mean, so as an artist, for instance, there are a lot of new movements around virtual reality, a lot around immersive installations, around using tech to create these alternative worlds for viewers to experience in different ways. But in many respects, when you are inside of an ancient Egyptian tomb, I mean, you're really seeing the first immersive installation. I
Sure.
had
Yeah, yeah.
the pleasure of recently experiencing the King Una's tomb. It was a fifth century, I'm sorry, fifth dynasty pharaoh, and you see the pyramid text engraved onto the walls of that tomb. The pyramid text being the first spiritual text of the human tradition. And when you're there, I mean, you're surrounded by these multicolored glyphs and icons. I mean, so you're getting this multi-sensorial, multidisciplinary experience because you're walking and you're seeing different texts on different walls. And there's a symbolism of what kinds of narratives are placed on what walls to match the symbolism of the directions. And all of the texts on the east walls of the different rooms have connections to each other. The texts that are inscribed on both sides of the same wall are speaking to each other. And then you're getting a narrative that's unfolding in three-dimensional space. Um, and so I don't even think we have language to understand the integration of writing, image, and architecture that's happening or in tombs that were created, 4,000 years ago. And
Yeah.
so there's still so much to learn that would really impact how we even think about, let's say, contemporary art, visual culture, etc. I mean, and that's a very surface example, but
Sure.
just one to kind of to speak to this question about the immense riches in these archives that are being ignored or undervalued.
Yeah. I think that's an amazing point about the immersive sort of artwork. I mean, the mystery traditions, right? Like they would create a very immersive environment and they would reenact sort of the death process as a way to kind of get people to have a spiritual awakening. And I think a lot of those originated in Egypt and in Africa as well. And again, that's sort of living spiritual art that's supposed to achieve transformation for folks. I had a conversation with Jeffrey Kripal, the professor, the Archives of the Impossible, and we were talking about how he views the imagination basically as the key to accessing the imaginal space, right? He
Yeah,
thinks it's an ontologically real place and that it interacts with us, but it does so through our imaginations, which means that, I mean, artists can and maybe should function as sort of shamanic kind of guides in some ways in order to kind of facilitate those connections and to you know I don't know, make them accessible to more folks. But I mean, I'm curious if you felt art helped you serve your spirituality. I mean, because I know that for a lot of folks that it's a transcendent experience to create. Sometimes you get into a flow
yeah,
state or some sort of deep concentration that can be very much trance-like. What are your thoughts on the connection between spirit and art, and
yeah.
how does it work for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I would say the there's a lot I would say to preface my response to this, but I would say the first thing is that certain traditions of art for art's sake do not exist in traditional contexts. So art is not really a separate category that is distinct from, let's say, medicine, from science, from religion, from philosophy. I mean, these are parts of holistic knowledge practices that were engaged in to move spirit in a certain way. And I try to work with that kind of traditional or indigenous concept of the purpose and function of art. I try not to um, create objects just to have pretty objects, but everything is done with a kind of ritual intent, with a magical intent in many cases. I guess I could give you an example. So, for instance, I worked on a film project called Obiumbo, the Primordial House, which was this experimental dance film drawing on West African Igbo cosmology that traces these two androgynous figures, Chukwu and Ekenechukwu, who create the world through dance. And as a part of doing this project, one exercise that we did as a collective team was to engage in a series of rituals to actually invoke these figures, Chukwu and Ekenechukwu, to ask how do they want to be represented in dance. So it wasn't a process of saying, oh, we're just going to make this nice film,
Yeah.
but we were really creating a ritual vehicle for these figures to manifest in the world. And it was interesting too, because the dancer Victoria Watford, who played the role of Ekenechukwu, had these very interesting experiences and encounters that happened to her once the film had, or once the filming had come to an end. I mean, so she was dealing with her own series of health challenges, and then Eke Nichuku started to appear to her in her dreams and started to give her messages around what she needed to do, the next steps she needed to take, the particular healer she needed to see. And I think that was an impact of the invocation work we did while actually making the film. And
Wow.
so again, I mean, these are not separate processes, but really an attempt to mobilize energy for um, for expanding the consciousness, not of just ourselves as the participants and creators, but to hopefully have that impact and effect on everyone who views the work or engages with it in some way.
How do we return to that kind of sacred approach to things? I mean, not that I don't expect you to have an answer to that question or anything, but I mean, like we live in a world that's so plastic and so based on entertainment and distraction and, goodies and all of that. And to my mind, it would be so much more satisfying to live in a world where we take things, seriously and we invest our activities with a certain kind of power and I don't know. That seems like one of the major obstacles facing human culture today is that a lot of us have lost the ability to even conceive of the universe in that way, and so we all feel alienated and disaffected. And you know, I don't
Yeah,
know.
no, that's a great question. I think about that all the time. And again, one has to do what is in one's own power and purview. And I think another lesson that we get from traditional African religions is that the smallest ritual or the smallest intent can have outsized impact. I mean, so I think in some respects it's easy to fall into a certain kind of despair or woe is me attitude when we see the magnitude of things in the world that we want to stand against. But it really can be something as simple as a quick prayer or ritual or seeding of an intention that can germinate and bloom in all kinds of ways. And I think my response to this question around how do we start to combat this lack of attention to spiritual forces and spiritual development in the larger world we live in is to really take the space of public art very seriously and
Yeah.
thinking about, okay, is there a piece of public space that I can imprint or shape in some way that might not solve the bigger problem, but at least starts to add a different kind of resonance or to push a vibrational direction in a different way. So like one of the projects here in Pittsburgh that I have up now is called The Three Sisters. And it's a light installation on three of the major bridges going from the north side into downtown Pittsburgh. And so those bridges are colloquially called the sister bridges. And so for this project, my collaborator Michaela Wuna and I, and we wanted to fuse this bit of Pittsburgh history with these Native American and African traditions. So in a Yoruba context, you have these sister goddesses, these figures, Yemaya, Oshun, and Oya. And in traditional Native American agriculture, you have these three sister crops that were grown together because they supported each other synergistically, maize, squash and beans. And so what we did is that we fused each particular bridge with an African goddess and a Native American crop, and we used lights to evoke the presence of these figures. So, like for instance, Yemaya is this maternal figure, this goddess of the ocean. And so you see these waves of blue lights that come in across the bridge. Or let's say on the Andy Warhol Bridge, when we're trying to evoke the spirit of corn, you see these yellow and green lights that travel up the suspenders to mimic the growth of corn stalks. And
Yeah.
so I think for us, that project was an attempt to say, hey, how can we fuse, technology, the most kind of avant-garde light displays with these kinds of indigenous cultural and spiritual traditions. I mean, and so when you see the work, I mean, you have to imagine these gigantic bridges and you have to imagine these as platforms to invoke these African energies or these spiritual energies. And, 2 million people will see these lights over the
Yeah.
course of the month and a half that the project will be up. And so I think that's a way of, again, seeding a certain
Yeah.
kind of return, a seeding of an intention of using our avant-garde technology to serve as a platform and a house for these ancient traditions to still live.
And I think it's interesting that these are monumental pieces of architecture, and like they've become so saccharine in our society. Like we need a bridge, we cross a bridge, but it doesn't have any meaning to us. But when you do something like that, you invest it with that kind of meaning, and it's almost a return back to kind of that earlier inclination, of previous civilizations, where like, those things were an expression of, sort of collective will and holy connection or whatever. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Two things I really wanted to ask you about. So, cultural appropriation. Um, if people like hear about African traditions or Native American traditions or even, Eastern traditions, and they find them inspiring and they find a lot of truth in that, should they feel reserved about getting their hands dirty in those subjects? Or do we live in a point in history where it's okay that we try and build a spiritual practice for ourselves out of different threads from different cultures? Where's the line there, and how can we, build something powerful without offending people or cheapening those topics?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Also, a very complicated and nuanced
Yeah,
question.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Sorry.
many things that I would say in response. So, on one hand, you're absolutely right. I mean, we live in a globalized world in a way that is unique to our particular moment in history. I mean, we have access to all kinds of spaces, traditions, ideas that people even, let's say, 60, 70 years ago would not have had. So we certainly have to figure out how to create frameworks that engage that knowledge and engage that newfound access in ways that are respectful and intentional. Um, but at the same time, of course, there are dangers in that. So I guess I would just say the things that I would caution against that I see
Yeah,
sometimes in some of these spaces is a kind of a mix and match approach.
yeah,
And I think people want to just kind of take what they like and just kind of throw everything else away. I think I do understand the impulse to do that, but I think one dangerous thing is that spiritual systems, initiatic systems, have been purposefully created
yeah,
in ways to challenge us, to prod us, and to force and catalyze our growth. So if we cavalierly just discard things we don't like, there might be moments that are necessary to push us out of comfort zones or to get us to face uncomfortable parts of ourselves that we're discarding just for the sheer pleasure of it.
yeah,
And I think often too, in our particular cultural context, there is a lack of discipline. And so I think sometimes people want to have an easy shortcut way to enlightenment, or people want to back out of things when they get hard or difficult. And so I would caution around too much of a syncretic approach, or I would kind of ask, is a syncretic approach really drawing on the best and the most advanced things that have been um, presented for our development, or are we holding on to things as an escape mechanism for not wanting to do the actual hard work that needs to be done?
Yeah, that's a good point. And it does seem like at times people treat things like this almost like accoutrements, like you want to present a certain face, so you adopt a certain thing from a certain culture or whatever. And it's like you ignore the tradition and the fact that it was curated over tens of thousands of years to become this tradition that achieves this kind of character development among its practitioners. And if you just want to, pop in and, wear the suit, then it cheapens the whole thing in a manner. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
Well,
good answer.
and I would say too, and that's the importance of cosmology. So, I
Yeah,
mean, cosmologies are organized around very specific steps, and very specific processes. So even if, again, to like, let's say, look at the ancient Egyptian tradition. I mean, you have a mandala, let's say, like the Dendera zodiac, which was carved into the ceiling of that particular temple. I mean, so there you have a very specific understanding of the procession of time. You have a very specific understanding of the energetic forces that are being activated at different times of the year. And so you have to have, wherever you land in these things, I mean, you have to have some kind of mandala that gives you a vision of the whole.
yeah,
And so I would just caution against a more kind of cut and paste approach if you are losing that sense of the whole and that sense of completeness.
yeah,
And whichever tradition you're going to look at, I mean, even if you kind of look at, let's say, traditions of Ifa divination, you have these 256 particular quadragrams that are used for that divinatory practice. So there's no way to kind of avoid that, because that is the structure. I mean,
yeah,
there are ways in which you can um, uncover new things about these 256 signs or apply them in new ways, but the full sense of the whole still has to remain intact. So I think it's really just about making sure one keeps an eye on the framework of the whole and making sure that there is a complete picture one is working with before making adaptations and changes.
yeah, absolutely. Real quick question on that divination system you were talking about. I think I've heard of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's similar to the I Ching, but more like whole. Can you give us a description of what it is exactly, just so people?
Yes. I mean, so it works on the same kind of binary principle that you see in these high oracles, the I Ching being one of them.
Mhm.
So I Ching, you basically have these six different lines, and each can be a yin or yang, and kind of an
Yeah.
offer on one, zero or one kind of option. So
Mhm.
that gets you two to the six, or 64 different combinations that Oracle can provide. And it's a very powerful Oracle. I mean, it can give information about health, diet, seasons, directions, colors, people. I'm full life path destinies. I mean, so there's a lot of symbolic information that is encoded into each of the lines and each of the symbols of that particular oracle. The Ifa oracle kind of works on the same principle. So you have these four levels, um, but then you have two different sides to that. So you have basically eight different kind of open slots with a single or double stroke, kind of an
Yeah.
off or on. So you basically have two to the eighth, or the 256 combinations that are possible with that particular oracle.
That's fascinating. And again, I mean, the sort of notion of primitive society is just, it just gets smashed the deeper you get into any of these traditions. It's like we're talking thousands, millennia of development and history and culture behind these things, and they're often beautiful and stunning. So I wanted to give a chance to plug your organization, the Rainbow Serpent. Can you talk a little bit about what the mythology of that is, and then sort of segue into what your organization is and what it does, and if people can support it, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I, along with Michaela Luna, am the co-founder and co-executive director of Rainbow Serpent. So it's an organization that is seeking to advance Black LGBTQ culture through the exploration of multimedia art, traditional African spirituality, emerging tech, and innovative healing protocols. And we work in projects across a variety of domains. I mean, so public art, sculpture, film, virtual reality, music, the light installations, spatial augmented reality, many different kinds of domains to explore these kinds of topics. We house a collective of artists, writers, technologists called the Rainbow Serpent Collective, a group of folks that span the United States, but also Brazil, Romania, Egypt, England, and Nigeria. Um, as I was saying earlier, our most recent work is this light installation called The Three Sisters, but we also have work on view quite literally around the world. So we have a photography and film exhibition that's now on view at Fotografiska in Stockholm in Sweden, but also at North Carolina Museum of Art. But I would just encourage people to go to our website, therainbowserpent.org, to get a sense of the full sweep of all of the projects that we've worked on and currently have on view.
Now, if people want to support that, is this it's a nonprofit or is it
Yes.
yeah, okay. So can people
Yeah, yeah,
give?
yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah. So we
yeah.
have a donate link on our website, and we certainly encourage people to go there if you would like to be involved in any way. I mean, we certainly would accept financial donations, but also if people have ideas about collaborative projects or if there are particular events that people would like us to help organize, we're happy to do that. So in addition to creating the art projects, I mean, we also have other branches as well. So on one hand, we organize retreats,
Hmm.
sometimes week-long retreats, sometimes weekend retreats. Particularly, we've worked in collaboration with the Esalen Institute out
Ah,
in Big Sur in California.
yeah.
And so, yeah, so that provides a venue for anyone to come and to get a more embodied introduction to these traditions. And so we use our artwork, whether film, um, etc., to provide introductions to these Black queer spiritual and cultural traditions. We do all kinds of exercises from ritual dance and movement to the sacred use of body paint, to certain kinds of death and resurrection exercises, guided visualizations, a whole host of unique spiritual modalities are introduced so that people can kind of understand how they could incorporate these kinds of insights into their daily lives and practices. We also do other kinds of educational workshops. I mean, so, podcasts like this, but also other kinds of events here in Pittsburgh and in other places around the world of lectures and educational events that people can attend as well.
That sounds fantastic. Excellent work, and I will put all the links I can in the description, and I appreciate all your hard work in that regard. Um, one question I had for you that sort of your art does incorporate a lot of technology. And one of the things that often gets blamed for our current malaise, right, is tech, whether it's AI, computers, whatever. Um, what is your thought on tech and incorporating technology and art, and technology's role in, corrupting the spirit or whatever? Is that does it have to go that way, or can you see technology in a different way as enabling perhaps connection?
Oh, I mean, you certainly can see technology as an enabling force. I mean, what you mentioned the I Ching earlier, I mean, the Oracle is a technology. I mean, the
Sure.
Oracle is a device that is giving access to spiritual wisdom, to information about the world. The pyramid is a technology. It's about using, as you said, I mean, certain kinds of mathematical proportions and geodesic proportions, and all other kinds of alignments in order to harness energy in certain ways. Um, so technology really is only as good as the people using it. Um, but with a cosmology as a grounding force, one can gain some ideas about how to use technology in a more enlightening way.
Yeah.
And I think that's certainly the point of some of the projects that we're engaging in. I mean, in particular, because many of the worldviews that are now animating the development of this kind of technology are still, of course, located in certain reductive forms of scientific materialism. And so
Yeah.
if you're approaching technology with that perspective, those are the kinds of biases that will be incorporated into it. And I think when we're engaging with technology, we're fighting biases on multiple different levels. I mean, from racial biases all the way up to metaphysical worldview biases. I mean,
I'm
so even
sure.
just to give an example, so let's say a project like the Four World Ages. I mean, so that was a project where we were thinking about how to, I'm sorry, hold on one second.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So there's a project like the Four World Ages, where we were using Ebo myth again, to think about these large narratives that try to understand and explain human history from, let's say, an initial age of divine unity, where all human beings are directly connected to each other. We don't have physical bodies. We can kind of float from earth to heaven. To our contemporary age, the fourth age, which is this age of chaos,
Mhm.
which, I mean, of course, needs no explanation if one just turns on the news. Um,
Yeah.
and so we were thinking about how to tell the story through performance and explain and illustrate these different world ages and the different kinds of dynamics that were operative in them. And so we wanted to use spatial augmented reality, basically using AI and computer vision to track the movement of dancers in real time and to be able to project symbols and different kinds of ideograms onto their bodies.
Hmm.
And what we quickly discovered when we started this project is that many of these systems were not or had not been calibrated to even recognize people with darker skin tones. So when we were starting the project, I mean, we had to do a lot of work just to get the system to like recognize that a black person was standing in front of it. And so that was,
It's not
and so
funny,
even
but
before we could get to all of this kind of cosmological narrative that we wanted to explore, and we had to physically figure out how to be seen. So
yeah.
I think one of the reasons we are so adamant about being in the technology space is because these not only do we need black people and black bodies to be registered in this world, but we
Mhm.
need these other worldviews that are about the divine potential of human beings, the way in which we can activate our God self to be a part of all of these technological developments as they're happening. And so when we're thinking about projects, we're constantly thinking about how can we, again, plant a seed, plant a different intention, and force these forms, these mediums, these technologies to work and shift and operate differently.
Um, Great answer. Last question. I mean, we're about an hour up, but I cover UFOs, right? That's one of the things I cover a lot of. I'm interested to hear your take on it, in terms of, I mean, we're in a moment where I think the government has sort of acknowledged that they actually exist. I'm not sure if I trust what their definition of a UFO is. There's a lot of things that are sort of still up in the air about whether or not it's a visionary phenomenon or if it's a nuts and bolts phenomenon, whether it represents something about consciousness or whatnot. Do you have any thoughts? And specifically, Stephen Finley and I had a conversation, and he mentioned that he would be interested to hear what your thoughts on are. Said I should talk to you about it. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much to say. I mean, again, as speaking as an advocate for and a mouthpiece of traditional African cosmologies, I mean, I would say these systems think about the world itself as a manifestation of divine presence. I mean,
yeah.
so every celestial body, so like the sun, the moon, Sirius, all of these figures are representations of divine beings. I mean, and so there's a completely different approach to understanding life itself in these systems. So not only on the highest level are all of these large celestial bodies living beings, but even bringing it more down to earth. I mean, even rocks, the mineral kingdom, are living beings. Literally, crystals, gems have a kind of consciousness and emit certain kinds of vibrations and energies. So I think from when you start with a worldview that says all of the world is teeming with life, with presence, with animated being, I think you approach these questions very differently, and I
Yeah.
think you don't see any surprise um, in this question. I mean, there's so many different pieces I would want to talk about. So, Malidoma Somé is one of my idols. I mean, he's a spiritualist from Burkina Faso, wrote several great books. It was interesting. He talked about returning from France at one point where he went to get his doctorate to his particular village in Burkina Faso where he was talking to his elders, and he talked about sharing the plot of Star Trek with them about, this hyper intense show that's about meeting all these different alien civilizations and all these different alien beings, and people can teleport and all of these things. And the elders just responded and just said, okay, what's new? I mean, so even though this was, on one hand, one of the outer reaches of Western science fiction, it didn't even strike these other people as something that could possibly be fictional or out of the ordinary.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, of course we have interdimensional beings and all kinds of figures that move beyond the human. So that was one anecdote that I wanted to share. And
Yeah.
also another going back to the Dogen case, since you mentioned it earlier. So there you have this idea about the nomom, these beings that come down from Sirius and in some respects end up seeding life on this planet. One interesting thing about the Nomo for me that actually doesn't get talked about much. I mean, so people sometimes talk about, the fact that these are these quasi reptilian figures, kind of part human, part reptile. And that has kind of taken up a lot of energy. But one
Mhm.
thing, I mean, when you read the actual anthropological accounts from Marcel Griot and the French anthropologists who kind of first made contact with them in the 1930s and 40s, you'll find that these Nomo are these very expansive creatures. So on one hand, they're also androgynous, they're bisexual, they are self-fertilizing, and they become these eight in particular, these kind of formative eight ancestors of humanity.
Yeah.
And so one thing about these figures is that they provide a very different understanding about our own gendered being and expansive gendered capacity that we
Yeah.
often narrow down in order to put ourselves into smaller kinds of boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I don't, and I might need to actually write about this because I don't see many people talking about the gender of these um UFO figures or beings, particularly with them being, like I said, androgynous, bisexual, self-fertilizing androgynous. I feel like they provide a different mode of being, a different
Yeah.
understanding about human possibility that we haven't even really begun to tap into yet.
Yeah. That's interesting. The your talk about the going back to the village and sort of sharing the Star Trek plot and them sort of shrugging. There was a book I was reading, and I'm not going to remember the title of it, so it's going to be a free-floating anecdote. But out of this book, there was the discussion was around telepathy and how in the Western cultures it's like, it's been proven in labs, but the evidence is always rejected. Materialist science basically says, it's not possible, so therefore it's not happening. And this guy conveyed this anecdote about traveling in Africa, and he had been on this dirt road somewhere. middle of nowhere, not a whole lot of marks around for people to sort of orient themselves. It was kind of the middle of nowhere, and this gentleman, a villager, walks up, and he's apparently been traveling. He's got a pack on him and stuff. And he just plops down at a clearing next to the road and says, it comes out that he's waiting for a friend in a couple of days. And the traveler, the guy who meets him there, eventually gets a story out of him that they had agreed to meet telepathically, and that 2 days later, the villager was like, "Oh, my friend's going to be late. I don't know if I'm going to have time to stay." And then he went to bed that night. When he woke up the next morning, oh, it's going to be fine. He'll be here in 2 days. And so the guy who was traveling, the solo guy, waits 2 days because he wants to find out if this is all true, if this guy's telling the truth. And this other villager walks up 2 days later, like right on cue, and they had somehow been like communicating through the ether, and it was not a big deal to these guys. And apparently, like among their tribesmen, this is a thing that happens all the time, and they just don't make a big deal out of it because they don't know that they should make a big deal out of it, and it's something that they are just sort of innately capable of because they were never told it's not possible.
Well,
Um,
exactly. Exactly. And
yeah,
that's what a cosmology does. It kind of
yeah,
tells you what is possible. And I mean, tied to that as well, I mean, so it also, a lot of these traditions are built on different models of the human. So there's an understanding, let's say in our contemporary cultural context, that we have a body and a mind, or a body and a soul, or a body and a spirit. Whereas in many of the African traditions, the human is a collection of many more kinds of spirit bodies. The ancient Egyptian context is probably, again, the most familiar one with people, so that's probably the easier one to go with. But
yeah,
in many anatomies of the human that you find, let's say in ancient Egypt, there are nine different spirit bodies. Um, from the most dense physical body that we're familiar with to
yeah,
an immortal body of light and sound waves. And of course, there are all these complex mummification processes to preserve the physical body, but also to provide platforms for some of the other spirit bodies that actually do survive the death process, or the
yeah,
death of the physical body anyway. So
yeah,
if you have a conception of, let's say, nine different bodies that are operating on different levels of density, communicating telepathically becomes less of an anomaly, because it's
yeah,
a question of like, well, which body is actually communicating? And
yeah,
if I have a particular immortal self and you have an immortal self that are linked and can connect with each other, that provides ways to disseminate different kinds of information that might not be possible if we were only thinking with the physical body that our material senses can detect. I mean, but there are other bodies that people like astral project with, bodies that appear
yeah,
in the dream world and that people use to navigate dream spaces.
yeah,
So all of the, again, the indigenous African traditions have this understanding of a multi-bodied human self, that can span and move through time and space very differently.
yeah. And I think that that's, I mean, maybe I'm prejudiced. I think that that's starting to be substantiated in different ways. I just listened to this podcast, the telepathy tapes. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but
Mm-mm.
it's a fantastic podcast. I recommend everyone listen to it. But it's basically the story of these kids who are nonverbal autistics. And they have trouble communicating, and they have trouble with controlling their bodies because of their condition. And they're finding that they are telepathically connected with their caregivers, and in
Oh,
some
wow.
cases with each other. And they're doing these tests, and I mean, listen to the podcast. It's amazing. But basically, it boils down to these kids can astral travel, and sometimes they get together and they gather and they form a community in this other space that they have access to because they have limited access to the physical reality, and they wanted to go somewhere, and that's what was available to them. And
Well, but really
you
it's
know,
available to all of us
exactly.
with
That's exactly right. Yeah.
yeah,
We
yeah.
just have to figure out how to get there. And I mean, like, we don't have the cosmology necessarily built in to do that. So we have to, find whatever tradition that we can to sort of learn from. But again, I mean, I think that involves being careful and taking it seriously, all of it, and not just, I want that piece and this piece because, yeah, like we talked about.
Yeah. Well, I would also say, James, too, if you do remember the where the anecdote came from that you just shared, if you could email that to me or send it to me, I
I
would
will.
appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. And I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and he may know. So I'll try and
Okay,
figure that
perfect.
out. And I'll look through the books have been. It was only a couple months ago that I read that. So yeah, no, absolutely. And there were other examples too. So it wasn't just that one example.
Yeah, I would love to see that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, man. I appreciate you. That's all I got.
Okay,
Fa
perfect.
fantastic conversation. Really,
Yeah,
really
and
good.
thank you again. I appreciate the invite and glad we were able to connect. And I feel like I'm in good company. I mean, it's like I said, I've watched so many of your videos, and I know so many of the other folks you've interviewed, from Jeff Kripal to Eric Wargo to Stephen Finley.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, you know, I'm in a community plugged in with folks who are exploring these kinds of issues and really happy to be asked and honored to be asked to kind of help participate in extending the conversation.